Hello again, everybody. So we're going to go over the World War II PowerPoint right now, and we'll start in 1938. And following up from the last PowerPoint, by 1938, Hitler is in complete control of Germany. You can call it Nazi Germany if you want, but we'll just say Germany. One of the first big issues he takes on is to ignore the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, the treaty that ends World War One. He foregoes a couple of provisions of the treaty. A couple they don't accept guilt. That remember the article, the guilt clause article in the Treaty of Versailles. Germany will no longer accept guilt for the war. They stop paying reparations for it. They ignore the sections where Germany is not allowed to have a military anymore or a navy. So it's really he's ignoring a lot of the sections of the Treaty of Versailles because he does not agree with it, and a lot of Germans don't agree with it in general. Our next point here, the Anschluss, this complicated looking word here, it's actually a German word. What it really means is taking control of non-German, German-speaking areas. In this case, we're talking about Austria. So this is Austria right here. In Austria, they speak German. They're ethnically German people, ethnically. It also includes, to a lesser degree, there's an area right here on the edge of the Czech Republic. What's the modern day Czech Republic? It's Czechoslovakia here. I have it zoomed in this ugly brown or orangey color here. That's known as the Sudetenland. And the Sudetenland, those are ethnic Germans who are there. They live in the Czechoslovakian nation, the modern day Czech Republic. So, as part of this Anschluss, taking over non-German, German-speaking areas or ethnic German areas, this is where Hitler wants to bring in all these territories into, I guess you could call it, Greater Germany, which brings us to the Munich Conference of 1938. This Munich Conference is kind of a big deal. Uh, Munich is a city in Germany where Hitler, Mussolini, Chamberlain, and a couple other major European powers were invited to discuss uh, Hitler and Germany's takeover of these non-German, ethnic German areas. I hope that's not becoming too confusing. Great Britain's representative at this conference is this guy Neville Chamberlain down here. That's the British Prime Minister in 1938. He's sort of the big player to come out of that, and we might remember him today as the appeaser. He ends up coming back to Great Britain after the conference, declaring peace in our time. We've satisfied Hitler because we agreed to let him take over Austria, which had already been taken over, in the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia, because Chamberlain's thinking is that Germany, once they get what they want, once Great Britain and other nations appease Germany, that Hitler will be done. He won't want to take anything else. An interesting note about the Munich conference, where they're discussing the fate of territory that belongs to Czechoslovakia. Anybody wondering who was not invited to the Munich conference, the one nation who you might think should definitely be there would be Czechoslovakia, but they weren't because they weren't invited. So I think that's one of the interesting notes of history that just sort of, it's crazy, but it happened. So Czechoslovakia was not invited to the Munich conference, where major European powers like Germany and Great Britain decided the future of Czechoslovakia itself. Also, before the war, World War II gets started, we get this German-Soviet non-aggression pact. Now, Russia today is known as Russia. Since the Bolshevik Revolution at the end of World War I, where we decided or discussed that Russia would pull out of World War I, they are complicated. It's a very complicated situation, but they become the Soviet Union. So Russia and the Soviet Union are kind of interchangeable terms in this period, but on the whole, we know them as the Soviet Union. So we're talking about the German-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact. We're talking about Germany and the Soviet Union. The terms of this non-aggression pact signed by Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin, these are their portraits up here, and here's a contemporary cartoon of Hitler and Stalin. Stalin is the leader. His name is Joseph Stalin. He's the leader of the Soviet Union in the lead up to World War II. He takes over after Lenin, who was the revolutionary leader in the Soviet Union. He takes over for him when Lenin dies, and he has been leading the Soviet Union. He leads the Soviet Union until his death, and we'll talk a lot more about him in a couple of weeks' time here. So, the terms of this pact, though, Germany and Russia agree that they won't fight when it comes to war because they both sort of know that war is coming. Another term is that they will split up Poland when the war starts, with the agreement We can see the map down here. Germany will take the western half of Poland. The Soviets will roll in and take the eastern half of Poland. Now these are modern borders right here. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Belarus, and Ukraine. Those are roughly the modern borders, but the big idea here is they are part of the Soviet Union at the time, and I'll talk to you more about this as we go along. A Soviet is sort of a republic within the greater Soviet Union, and I'll get into more detail as we go along there. So Estonia is the Estonian Soviet within the Soviet Union. Latvia is the Latvian Soviet within the Soviet Union, and so on. So when we're talking about the Soviet Union, it's this union of various republics. What they're calling republics, we wouldn't call them that necessarily because nobody really gets to vote. So that's what we're talking about. We're talking about the Soviet Union. So those are the big terms of the Soviet Non-Aggression Pact. This guy von Ribbentrop, he is the German foreign minister, and this guy Molotov, who you might have heard of Molotov cocktail. So it's Molotov cocktail is a weapon that you can use in battle or war. Sort of named after this guy, but he is the Soviet foreign minister, and they are the two, von Ribbentrop and Molotov, who come up with the terms of the German-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact that Hitler and Stalin both agree to. And then right down here, so the Soviet Union, for our purposes, I'm going to use them interchangeably just because sometimes we get mixed up, but it's okay. But they also equal the USSR. So the USSR in English stands for the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and these are the various republics, again, that are united to become the Soviet Union. Stalin, this man, he's the chairman of the Soviet Union. If you're going to give him a title, like the German leader is called the Chancellor, the American leader is called the President, the British leader is called the Prime Minister. The Soviet leader, he's called a Premier, which is kind of silly sounding, but it's all just a fancy way to say that Stalin is the dictator of the Soviet Union. And like with World War I, we don't have time to go over the entire war, but we're going to hit most of the highlights as we go along here. And we'll start with the beginning of the war, and this is debatable because historians have argued that World War II, especially in Asia, started much, much earlier. And in fact, I read an article just last week that Chinese textbooks are changing the date of the start of World War II in their public school textbooks with Japan. You'll note that Japan and China were at war for several years before World War II officially begins in Europe. And so what World War II actually is, it's this large series of many different conflicts. In the United States, we talk about different theaters of war, the European theater versus the Pacific theater. While in the European theater, we put the date that the war begins at September 1st, 1939. So that's where we get that date from. We'll just go over some key terms as we're going along here too. But September 1st, 39 is when Germany actually invades Poland, shortly followed by Russia in the east. So Germany invades Poland, and they use this tactic called Blitzkrieg, and these are a bunch of German words. Blitz is lightning, and Krieg means war. So we get Blitzkrieg, this lightning war, where it's a very rapid style of warfare developed in Germany, where you would send in planes to start with, and they would take out a bunch of defensive areas, followed by armored infantry. And we say armored infantry, some of you military buffs, we know we're talking about infantry that's just regular foot soldiers supported by tanks and other artillery pieces. So we're talking about, and any of you military buffs can feel free to jump in and correct me in the comments section on our Canvas page. But this Blitzkrieg, this is employed first in Poland. Later on, we'll talk about Blitzkrieg in the West when Germany invades France. Spoiler alert, that's coming up though. The Wehrmacht, this is another German word. In German, you pronounce W's like V's because they're, that's just how they do it. So this is the regular German army. This would be like the everyday soldier who joined or was conscripted into the German army. There's a lot of enlistments though, because German people are happy to have jobs in the army. So this would be sort of your everyday soldier. People like you and me would join the Wehrmacht. I guess us boys, girls aren't necessarily allowed to join, unfortunately. This is the big one. This is the most of the German army. It's known as the Wehrmacht. The next term we have here, the Totenkopf. That's in German. Toten is death's, Kopf is head, so the death's head. That's what they're known as. Later on, sort of simultaneously, they're the Schutzstaffel. Again, it's a German word. Schutz is protection. Staffel is squad. So they're the protection squad. The SS, these are the guys with that lightning bolt symbol, who I think we have a picture of coming up. These are the sort of the devout Nazis, if you will. They're the people later on who will be tried as war criminals because they committed the atrocities. We talk about the Holocaust, the Schutzstaffel, the SS. They're the ones who are in charge of killing Jews and other ethnic minorities. So those are just some of the key terms. This is the war begins September 1st. And now a few days later, on September 3rd, Great Britain and France in turn declare war on Germany. So there's this period of 2 days where Poland is sort of at it alone. Uh, and you think, well, that's when the war really picks up pace. And no, it doesn't. We get this period that's known as the Sitzkrieg, which is it's an English play on that Blitzkrieg. So you can see here, sitz is what you think it is, sitting. The sitting war is what it's known as because nothing happens for a little while here. But we have, so here's from the San Diego Union, Britain declares war. France also declares war on Germany because of their invasion of Poland. And remember back to World War I, we talk about that series of alliances. Well, alliances do play another key role in World War II. They're not secret alliances like they had been, excuse me, in World War I. Remember some of the terms of the Treaty of Versailles and the 14 points outlawed secret alliances, so it was known that this would happen. Also, in this time period before the war starts picking back up in the West, in the Frankish region, we get this Russo-Finnish War, which you might never have heard of before. So on November 30th of 39, Russia decided to invade Finland. And Finland, if we'll zoom in right here, so this is sort of another zoomed in map. So here's the Soviet Union, here's Germany. So Finland's up here. It's one of these, I don't know if they consider themselves Scandinavians, but sometimes we just sort of call them Scandinavian countries, along with, so Sweden's right next to it, and Norway right next to there. I don't think they consider themselves Scandinavians, so if you hear me call them Scandinavians, that's my bad. But anyway, Russia invades Finland, and we get this long period, sometimes known as the Winter War, where Russia and Finland are fighting. And November 30th in Finland and Russia, it gets pretty cold. So it's this rather lengthy and drawn out war between Russia and Finland that lasts the whole winter. And there's these images of Finnish soldiers transporting themselves on what look like skis. They're pretty much just skis, transporting themselves across terrain because it's just snow everywhere. If we look at the actual geography, it's pretty far north, and so I mean it does get rather cold there, and it stays rather cold for a long time. So the Russo-Finnish War is another element to World War II, and we talk about it as a series of, I don't want to call them smaller, but like smaller wars grouped together becomes a much larger war. Now that Sitzkrieg, it lasts for, in the West at least, it lasts for pretty much the entire winter. The next major German action is against Denmark and Norway, and those are actually Scandinavian countries. They'll consider themselves Scandinavian, and that's by April of 1940. And rather quickly, Germany takes over these two countries using the Blitzkrieg tactics. And so we have on this map up here, this smaller map, by April 9th, Denmark surrenders. By June 10th, Norway surrenders, and the Germans occupy those countries. A month later, Germany attacks what's known as the Low Countries, and that would be Luxembourg, Belgium, and the Netherlands, who all surrender rather rapidly in May. France is the major one. France comes next. We get this miracle evacuation at Dunkirk, which I think is rather well known and is going to become a little bit better known. Sometime in a couple of months, there's going to be a new movie coming out called Dunkirk, which deals with this evacuation. And what had happened is Great Britain had sent in soldiers to France because they were anticipating a German attack on France. So Great Britain sent soldiers, and there are French soldiers there, and their Dunkirk is actually up here, right on the coast, on the Channel coast, and about 300,000 soldiers, well-trained professional soldiers, are evacuated from France back to England. And there's some varying degrees of speculation about why Germany let this happen. And just to, not to get too into it, but to get a little into it, there was, for a long time in Germany, a hope that Great Britain would become allies with Germany against the East, even though the Soviets and Germans aren't fighting yet. Everybody sort of knew eventually Nazism and communism would have to fight it out. And so Germany was hoping that Great Britain would ally with them. So one of the ideas here is that they wouldn't annihilate these 300,000 soldiers stuck on the beach in the hopes that later on Great Britain would ally with Germany. We know, of course, that that never happens, but in 1940 and early 1940, the Germans were still hopeful that Hitler, especially, he's one of the big ones who does hope that Great Britain will ally with them. And there's another sort of, I guess you'd call it a hilarious story. One of the German ministers, this guy Rudolf Hess, he actually flew a little biplane over to Great Britain. He crashed, or he landed in some old man's farm, and he was arrested and kept in jail pretty much for the remainder of the war. But the reason that he was going over there was that he wanted to negotiate with the British government a alliance between Germany and Great Britain, and it just never happens. So here's some of the images of the evacuation. And the evacuation, it's large ships take part in this, but also small fishing boats, little dinghies, any sort of floating um, vehicle, just call it a boat. Any sort of boat was used for this. So ordinary citizens with fishing boats were encouraged to go rescue British soldiers stuck in Dunkirk. And so we have a zoomed in map here. Dunkirk right next to Belgium. It's a pretty close, in pretty close proximity to mainland England. And this English Channel is actually a very good defensive barrier. So I like to make sort of this joke. I guess it's a joke, but the last time that England was successfully invaded was actually way back in 1066, like the year 1066, where the Norman conquest of England took place. Take a World Civ 2 class and you learn a little bit more about it, or maybe just a medieval history class in general. Dr. Barton in the history department does some pretty good medieval history classes, and I highly recommend those. So this barrier, this English Channel barrier, actually serves its purpose pretty well. And 300,000 soldiers eventually are taken back to England, where they survive and they live to fight another day. Which brings us to the fall of France. When Great Britain pulls out because they can't be any more help, France is left to stand alone. And in the past, decade and a half or so, it happened a lot during when the Iraq War, this most recent Iraq War, was getting started up. France was not always so popular in the United States with certain sectors of society. For example, in the U.S. Capitol, on the lunch menu, they changed French fries to call it freedom fries. There's historical precedent for that. We called sauerkraut during World War I, we called it Liberty cabbage, because sometimes things just sound silly. But France, though, we think of them as just sort of this joke in terms of military force today. I mean, a lot of us think that way. Maybe not all of us think that way. But up to World War II, they were considered one of the premier fighting forces in the world. Like, you didn't want to go to war with France because they had such a good army. It was well-trained army, well-supplied army. And this, you can trace this back historically. Think of Napoleon in the early 19th century, where France pretty much takes over most of Europe for, over a decade. France is sort of the bee's knees, and that lasts, that sort of idea of the French army being a rather good army lasts up until World War II, where they sort of get caricatured into these, they'll surrender rather rapidly. Remember, Willie called them cheese-eating surrender monkeys. So, that's just sort of the joke we have today. But there are a couple of reasons why France falls so quickly. They develop after World War I what's known as the Maginot Line. They didn't want to have that long. Everybody sort of knew in the world, any smart military guy knew that war was inevitable. Like, it was going to happen again. World War I ended, and it was just a 20-year peace. And kind of literally it was. So France develops this fortification line known as the Maginot Line. In English, it looks like Maginot, but for the French is Maginot. And so that is along this line right here, where they have heavy fortifications in this bolted out section. There are weaker fortifications along the coast of Belgium, or not coast, the border of Belgium. That's all part of the Maginot Line. This is supposed to defend France. One not so great attribute of the Maginot Line is that all the guns were fixed pointing towards Germany. you couldn't turn them around to defend yourself, to defend France if the Germans crossed the line. And what do you think they did? They probably didn't go through these strong fortifications like in World War One. They actually came through Belgium first, and that's how they get into France. So by June of 1940, June 22nd specifically, France surrenders. They mostly surrender because of bad intelligence. Most of the soldiers were sent to the wrong place. They were sent to this strong fortification line down here when the German invasion came through Belgium. So France falls. Great Britain now famously stands alone because Germany and Soviet Union are not yet at war. What we have next is called Operation Sea Lion here. Operation Sea Lion was the German plan to invade England, and I just sort of gave it away by saying the last time England was successfully invaded was 1066. So this is the plan. It never works. Hitler is still not sure. Remember, on the last slide we talked about maybe this alliance with Great Britain and Germany. He's still thinking that that's a possibility. Hitler also, though, he knows that Russia, the Soviet Union, they're going to have to go to war with them eventually, so he can't decide whether to invade Russia or Great Britain first. So there's this sort of period of just not knowing what's going to happen next, even in the German high command. So now Great Britain is alone, and we get what's known as the London Blitz because Operation Sea Lion never took place. Germany doesn't invade Great Britain on land. What they do instead is invade them, in air quotes, through the air. We get this thing called the London Blitz. And now, usually, if we were in a class, I would point at this map down here and say, what are all these little red dots? And one of you would tell me, well, that's every place that Germany bombed during the London Blitz. And you'd be right, because this little map here represents every single bomb that was dropped on, this is actually a zoomed in picture of London, the London Blitz. So during that time period of Germany attacking Great Britain from the air, it's this part of this larger battle known as the Battle of Britain. And the Battle of Britain is significant because it's the first time that a battle is decided almost exclusively by air power. We talked during World War I about some of the airplane aces. German Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron, talked about him before. So there had been airplane battles before, but none up to this point were exclusively done with aircraft. This is the first time the Battle of Britain is the first time aircraft is the exclusive decider of a battle. The battle is fought almost completely in the air. This also marks, though, the first time that Germany doesn't achieve its major goal because Great Britain is successful in this battle. And the British, what's known as the RAF, Royal Air Force, the British Royal Air Force, ends up not defeating, but really doing well against the German Air Force, sometimes called the Luftwaffe. The Luftwaffe in German, Luft is air, and Waffe is like army or weapon, so it's the air weapon. So that's, just some more, I guess, trivia what they're called. We have images here, so this would be German planes flying over Great Britain, dropping bombs. And in London, you're familiar with the Tube system, sort of their subway metro system. This is where people would go. You'd sound a siren, and everybody would run down to these air raid shelters, these makeshift air raid shelters in the subway stations. So the German war effort sort of stalls in the West because Great Britain puts up a pretty good defense against them. Now you might be wondering what's going on in other theaters. Well, Italy finally enters the war in June of 1940. Italian leader Benito Mussolini, again, like what happened in World War I, he wants recognition for Italy. They want to be known as sort of a major power in the European stage. So Italy finally enters the war, and they attack in North Africa in coastal areas in the Mediterranean, in and around the Mediterranean Sea. Notably, they attack British Egypt, but also other places. You see down here, Abyssinia, that's Ethiopia, modern-day Ethiopia. There's this, through the 30s, the 20s and the 30s, there's actually, Italy loses a war to Ethiopia. You might have heard of Ethiopian Emperor Haile Selassie before. I had an Eritrean student last semester who they still consider him something of a hero over in that area. But it's just, it was this sort of massive failure for the Italians and sort of an embarrassment on the world stage where they lose to Ethiopia. But that was a little while ago now. By 1940, Italy is back at it and they're attacking regions in North Africa. They also attack Greece, so this area down here. And what we'll notice about the Italian attack on Greece is that it fails. Mussolini never told Hitler, he never told Germany that he was going to invade Greece, and he just did it, and the Italian army started struggling rather quickly. If I'm trying to point out movies that I've heard of before, and there's this terrible movie called Captain Somebody's Mandolin, starring Nicolas Cage couple years ago, probably a decade and a half ago at this point. But that highlights what's going on in the Italian invasion of Greece. Is it Captain Corelli's Mandolin? I'm gonna look it up. Okay, I looked it up. It was called Captain Corelli's Mandolin, where you get to see some of the imagery of Italy fighting Greek resistance in Greece. And with Italy's failure, Germany decides that their ally can't fail like this. So Hitler decides that Germany has to come and bail them out. And German soldiers are sent to Greece to help out with the Italian invasion there. And that's part of the distraction from Germany's plans to invade Great Britain. Now, Italy's entry into the war has two major effects. One is that it dramatically increases the scope of the war, because now, not that it wouldn't have otherwise, remember back when we talked about that historical narrative and things could have happened a number of ways, but they happened this way. They bring in North Africa to the war for the first time, and North Africa becomes a major player, a major theater, I should have said, in the war later on. But it also influences Germany's moves. Italy didn't do so good with their invasion of Greece, so Germany has to come bail them out, and this is just one of these influences on Germany. They have to move their own soldiers to help out some of their failing allies. So the next major operation we're going to talk about involves the Soviet Union and Germany. This one is known as Operation Barbarossa. Both Hitler and Stalin knew that they were going to fight eventually, even when they signed that non-aggression pact. What happened here is that Stalin dramatically undervalued how soon Germany would be invading them. He thought he had at least a few years, and it turns out by 1941, so in June of 1941, Germany finally invades Russia. Barbarossa is actually this rather famous hero from German history. Barbarossa had been a Holy Roman Emperor, and if we go back, Germany used to be unified loosely in a system known as the Holy Roman Empire, and he's associated with German nationalism. He dates to the 11th century. It's kind of outside of the scope of what we're doing here. Don't confuse him with Captain Barbossa, who Geoffrey Rush plays in the Pirates of the Caribbean. Back to it. There are four major goals of Operation Barbarossa. One is that Germany wants more land. Part of the German ideal, and it goes to racial ideology and a lot of complicated issues in Germany, is they need more living space, what's called Lebensraum. Lebens, living, and Raum is room, so living room, we call it living space, wherein just territory in the east where these large German families could move and own farmland after the war was over. That was the idea there. So they need more land for Lebensraum, in the east. There's also some oil fields out in Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan is over in this area to the east, and there's oil there, and anybody who's conducting the war, a war, needs lots of oil, and there's oil available in Azerbaijan that Germany wants to get to. They are also interested in exterminating Bolshevism, or more specifically, communism. Communism is seen as an evil to a lot of Americans, but also to Nazis too. So they want to get rid of Eastern Bolshevism, Eastern communism. A fourth major goal here is to exterminate racially inferior Slavic people. And if we look at what that word means, Slavs are sort of an ethnicity, kind of an ethnicity in Eastern Europe. Now, the Holocaust hasn't actually started in earnest yet. That doesn't come until a little bit later. But there has always been the goal of getting rid of racially inferior people as far as the Nazi Party is concerned. And these Slavic people in the East, it's an ethnicity. Germany wants to eliminate them as they're invading Russia through Operation Barbarossa. There are three main invasion points, and just to put it on there, this Operation Barbarossa opens up a 1,000-mile long front. So 1,000 miles is roughly from the coast. So think of Virginia Beach or wherever, Myrtle Beach, all the way over to St. Louis. That's 1,000 miles. That's how long this front is. And the three main invasion points along this front are in the south, the Baltic region, down here, through the middle is central Russia, and then towards Leningrad in the north. Leningrad, St. Petersburg, we know it as St. Petersburg, but it was called Leningrad at the time. And the Soviets, though, are not prepared for war in June of 1941. So they're not prepared for a couple of reasons. One is that part of uh, Soviet ideology, I guess, Stalin's paranoia more than anything, is that he got rid of a bunch of generals who he thought Stalin thought could challenge him during the 1930s. So a bunch of the good generals who would have been able to deal with a situation like this were executed or sent off to hard labor camps in Siberia uh, in the 1930s. So he doesn't have very well trained officers uh, in 1941. He also had not approved mobilization. Stalin never approved mobilization along the German border because he didn't want to make Hitler mad and force him to invade sooner. So at this point, the Soviets are just not prepared for a war yet. And there's no real response for weeks. Uh, Stalin sort of goes into hiding, just locks himself in his bedroom, according to some historians, for a couple of weeks because he doesn't know what to do. And Hitler surprised him by invading when he did. But once he finally comes to his senses, he orders the scorched earth policy. So, with the scorched earth, it's exactly what it sounds like. You burn everything so the enemy can't use it. You scorch the earth as they're invading, and you're retreating. So, that's what's happening. That's the scorched earth policy. And in the meantime, what does Great Britain think? Well, they hate communism probably as much as Nazis do, but they decided, the British government decided that they can't just let Germany conquer Russia because then Great Britain would really be alone with no help. The United States in June of 41 still hasn't entered the war. Thinking about our timeline here. We're getting there, but not yet. So Germany originally planned to take over Russia within 6 weeks, and like it happened in previous invasions of Russia, winter happened. So winter happens, and the Germans get bogged down. Russia, meanwhile, while winter's coming, because winter's always coming, Russia digs in. They dig these trench lines, ditches, barbed wire. So here you put just regular people to work digging these trench lines with the idea that Germany wouldn't be able to get their tanks through uh, these fortifications. So here's a little representation of a trench line. This isn't exactly the same as the trenches, the trench warfare of World War One. Similar, in the fact that they dug trenches and held their ground, if you will. But it is a little bit different. But that's what's happening with Germany invading. So winter is the big deal, though. If we think back to our World Civ classes, Napoleon invaded Russia, and winter happened, so he lost. Invaded with 600,000 men, and came back with 10% of that. So Germany invades Russia. Winter happens, and they get bogged down. They don't lose immediately, but they get bogged down rather quickly once the Russian snow sets in. So they get bogged down, and there are some major costs to this invasion. It becomes one of the major reasons that Germany loses the war. We like to think in the United States that the United States had a lot to do with Germany losing, but the Soviets also have a lot to do with Germany losing. And here we have some propaganda posters from the Soviet Union. And I don't speak Russian quite as well as I pretend, so you can translate them if you want. They're actually a good fighting force once they get their stuff together. Another cost of this invasion for Germany, though, is that it drains German resources because you have to send. I mean, initially it was over 1 million soldiers were sent to invade Russia, and it's a loss, so it hurts German morale. They hadn't experienced losses like this before. They didn't achieve their goal with the Battle of Britain. Germany didn't, but they didn't lose quite this bad. It also diverts all the main part of the fighting German army to the east because there's a lot more Soviet soldiers available than there were soldiers in the West, in France and Great Britain. The biggest turning point in this invasion is the Battle of Stalingrad. You might have heard of this before. If we can pick out some movies, think of was the one with Jude Law. Sorry, I had to look it up. It's called Enemy at the Gates with Jude Law. That deals with the Battle of Stalingrad, and this is one of the biggest turning points in the war. Germany ends up losing most of its army that it had sent to this city. The losses total are about 1 million on each side. This is considered the deadliest battle in history. For a long time, it had been another battle, but this one becomes the deadliest in history. Not that any battle isn't important to a person involved in it. I don't want to diminish that. The Soviets, though, after this battle, push back, and Germany, for the rest of the war, is on the retreat. So after the Battle of Stalingrad, they are never on the offensive again, at least in Europe. So you might be wondering what the United States is doing during all this. Well, nothing. Well, not nothing. They're doing some stuff, but they're not officially involved in the war until December 7th of 1941, which we know is the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. And you think, wow, Japan attacked, so why does the United States get involved in the European theater? Well, it's very complicated reasons. Germany actually ended up, because they had this alliance signed with Japan, Germany ends up declaring war on the United States. So the United States never had to declare war on Germany here. They do. They didn't, didn't have to. So there's some debate, some historical debate about whether or not the United States would have had a reason to go to war in Europe if Germany never declared war on them. It was just sort of assumed that they would. So anyway, but that's a complicated debate. And if you'd like to open up a discussion about it, we can do that on the weekly questions side. So that's fine. I'd be happy to jump in on that one to direct you to some books or something. But the United States, inevitably, they get involved in late 41. It's December, so it's the last month. So 1942 is when the United States is really getting their act in gear. One of the decisions between presidents of the United States, Franklin Roosevelt, and the new Prime Minister of Great Britain, Winston Churchill, is that they should take care of Europe first, and then they'll deal with the Japanese in Asia. Not to say that there isn't fighting going on in the Pacific Theater at the time. There is a lot of it, actually. But the main focus should be Europe first, and that's what ends up happening. So in 1942 through 1943, the U.S. and Great Britain spent an awful lot of time fighting in North Africa and then into Italy, and we get these some of these rather famous battles that you might not have heard of. Casablanca, you might know that movie. That's considered one of the best movies of all time. It's about the Battle of Casablanca. Algiers is another huge one. Battle of Tripoli is another huge one. Battle of El Alamein is another huge one. Another city that's been in the news a lot the past few years is Benghazi, and I bet none of you knew where. Well, maybe a couple of you knew where it was, but it's actually right here. That's where Benghazi is. So there's a battle there. So this is one of these major battle sites from the war. The Battle of Tunisia is another big one. So this is considered the North African theater, the North African campaign. There's a couple of famous people who come out of on both sides. On the British side, Bernard Montgomery, he's a general of the British Army. He's sort of the famous guy that comes out of the North African campaign. You might have heard of on the German side, this guy Erwin Rommel. He gets this nickname, the Desert Fox, because they do so well fighting in the desert against the British. He comes out of this North African campaign, famously a German general. So there's some of the major players on both sides. So North Africa is taken over, and then the U.S. and Great Britain decide, oops, definitely didn't mean to do that, decide to invade Italy. And so they invade Italy and end up deposing Mussolini, and that means they take him take him out of power. He's no longer in charge in 1943. And what Italy does, like they had done in World War I, they form a new government and change sides again. That's not to suggest that this was an easy process. There's actually some very heavy fighting that goes on in some of these Italian cities as they're moving their way up the Italian peninsula and starting in Sicily. Some of these major battles, Messina. Where I'm going to look in here, see if I can find some of the other major ones. Well, it's not listed. Monte Cassino is one of the huge ones. Salerno is another huge battle. But there's actually a lot of heavy fighting that goes on on the Italian peninsula that we just don't know a whole lot about, because most of the movies that have been made about World War II have to deal with fighting in France and Belgium and into Germany. But these two theaters, these campaigns here, were big deals. Like there's a lot of death on both sides during them, and a lot of U.S. soldiers actually got their training. Excuse me, got their training I guess their hands-on training fighting in North Africa and in Italy. And I like to reference, hopefully you guys have watched Saving Private Ryan, when Tom Sizemore, he has his little tins full of the dirt from the various campaigns. So the people who invaded on D-Day, which we're going to get to in a second, uh, they had fought in North Africa, they had fought in Italy prior to going to fight in France. So Italy is deposed. They're pretty much taken out of the war. You don't hear anything else about them for the rest of the war. Meanwhile, in Germany, the United States and Great Britain had been on this bombing campaign for some time, where the United States would take over the daytime bombing, Great Britain would take over the nighttime bombing, and they're bombing various cities, industrial cities and not so industrial cities. And there's some historical debate about whether or not the bombing campaigns were ethical or whether or not they were war crimes. And the one particular example I like to bring up is the bombing of Dresden. And it's a firebombing campaign, meaning you drop these incendiary bombs that would set everything on fire. And some of these old cities are pretty wooden. There's a lot of wood that burns better than concrete wood, I guess. And so Dresden, it's a city in Germany, was bombed, and the entire city catches on fire, and people, just sort of to graphically explain it, people jump into the river that runs through the middle of the city. But what had happened is that the flame was so hot from the fire that people who jumped into the river were boiled alive in the river. So, and there's even today, I visited Dresden 10 years ago now, and you can still see scorch marks on some of the buildings in the city from this fire that had been set by the U.S. and Great Britain during this bombing campaign. So, but and it's debatable whether or not these are war crimes or not. But anyway, by 1944, though, Stalin, leader of Soviet Union, is begging for a second front in Europe. The United States and Great Britain have been fighting in North Africa. In Italy, they're fighting a lot of Italian troops, though, and some, a lot of Germans too. But Stalin really wanted a second front to be opened up in uh, Europe. He thought he's a pretty paranoid guy, and we'll get back to this paranoia a lot this semester. Stalin was pretty sure that the U.S. and Great Britain were going to let Germany just completely destroy the Soviet Union before they actually got involved, and it didn't happen that way. But that's what he thought for a long time. And by June of 1944, the U.S. and Great Britain finally comply with the Second Front in Europe, and we get D-Day, known as Operation Overlord. It's June 6, 1944. This is one of these dates in history that I just think everybody should remember. And just to tell you what it is, we know this particular operation as D-Day, but in military terms, every invasion, like any date that invasion took place, would have been known as D-Day. We just associate Operation Overlord as D-Day because it was the biggest. It's the largest amphibious invasion in the history of ever. And here's some images of the U.S. Dropping off soldiers on the beaches on what's known as these Higgins boats, and they're just for troop transport. Now, before we actually get into the invasion itself, if we look here, this map is not in English. But anyway, so here's Great Britain up here. Here's the English Channel. And you'll see in this area right here, that looks like the closest point. There's a point here called Calais. Um, Germany, and Hitler especially, were convinced that the invasion point was going to be at Calais just because it was the closest region from Great Britain to mainland Europe. Meanwhile, Germany had been setting up these defensive structures, and it became known as Festung Europa, Fortress Europe, where they built concrete walls and installed guns along the coast of northern France here, anticipating a British and American invasion. And they put the heaviest defenses here in Calais, so along this line, where they were pretty sure that that the invasion was gonna come. And actually, the Americans and the British did a pretty good job of faking out the Germans. They created what's known as a dummy army, where they set up inflatable tanks and fake soldiers along this point closer to Calais to trick the Germans into thinking that's where the invasion was going to come. They even you might have heard of General Patton before. There's a famous movie about him. They put Patton in charge of this fake army. He wasn't too happy about it, but they wanted to sell it because Patton had been one of the heroes of North Africa and the Italian campaign. So they thought by putting him in charge of that, because he wasn't in charge of the actual invasion, it would really give credence to the idea that they were going to invade Calais. We know now that they didn't invade there. The Germans didn't. They invade. They invaded along the Norman beaches at Normandy. So here's just a zoomed in map. It's in this circled area right here. There's actually 5 beaches. The United States got Utah and Omaha Beach. Omaha is considered the heaviest of these beaches, the most heavily fortified. Great Britain got Sword and Gold. Canada is actually involved too, and they invade Juno Beach. So any of you who have Canadian friends, you can tell them you're proud of them for having a beach at Normandy. So this is the invasion, and so the invasion actually starts with paratroopers made famous by the Band of Brothers in the wee hours of the morning, 1 and 2 a.m. The invasion actually starts, and it's reported back to Germany, Berlin, the capital of Germany. It's reported back to Berlin, but nobody woke up Hitler until about 9 a.m. because, God forbid you would wake up the Fuhrer. He's known as Der Fuhrer. I think we went over that in his PowerPoint. So nobody wakes him up until 9 a.m. The beach invasions themselves actually start around 5 and 6 a.m. And for a while, their German army is pretty sure, the German high command is pretty sure that this is a fake invasion to distract them from the real invasion coming at Calais. They just didn't know the scope of it. So there's actually some tanks that are being held back around Paris. These 2 armored divisions, what's known as armored divisions of the German army, this Panzer divisions, and they are not sent immediately to the beaches because they were pretty sure, the German high command was pretty sure that was a fake invasion at Normandy, and the real one was coming at Calais any minute now. So they don't send those armored divisions in, and the United States and Great Britain, with Canada's help, take over these beachheads rather quickly, and they establish an Allied presence on continental Europe for the first time since the evacuation at Dunkirk. So once the Allies, the U.S. and Great Britain, are back on continental Europe, they start by making very slow progress through France. There is an Allied push through eventually, but there's problems moving through the French countryside because of these hedgerows, what look like just bushes on overhead cameras. I guess they didn't bother to consult any French geographers, but they're actually these rather densely thicketed hedgerows where you really can't make much progress through northern France. This sort of blurry image here, it's difficult to make it through there, and it takes a long time. It takes weeks before they finally make it through, just sort of the initial invasion points because of these hedgerows. And they're making slow progress as they're going along, and later, in 6 months or so later, we're getting towards wintertime, and it's December, and Germany makes their last-ditch effort to push the Allies out of France and back into Great Britain, push the United States and Great Britain out back into Great Britain, and we get what's known as the Battle of the Bulge, one of these, turning points in history battles. It's known as the Ardennes Offensive. It's actually in French, Ardennes. The Ardennes Forest, it's just large forest. It had been significant during World War I too. And this is the German army pushes back, and they create this bulge in the Allied lines, illustrated here, and so that's why it's unimaginatively called the Battle of the Bulge. What ends up happening is that over the course of the winter, also made famous by Band of Brothers, the Allies win that battle. They push Germany out, and on the Western Front, they are now Western Front. The Germans are also on the retreat like they were on the Eastern Front against the Soviets, and they start pushing into Germany itself. They liberate these countries as they're going along. Meanwhile, Russia, the Soviets, are rapidly advancing towards Germany in the east, but it's a large front here, so it's taken them a long time to do it. So the Allies are finally moving into Germany, and as the further they're going, they meet less and less resistance. German soldiers just start surrendering en masse because they know the war is over, and they'd rather surrender than die, which I guess is how a lot of people feel about living. I mean, maybe it's different today. Maybe some of the military men, or women, if you're keen on discussing it, can let us know sort of what the mantra is today. I know we certainly don't want to surrender to anybody, but the Germans knew they were going to lose, so they'd rather surrender. Surrendering is popular on the Western Front to the Americans and the British because Americans and British treated prisoners of war a lot better than the Soviets would have treated German surrendering prisoners. So anyway, that was sort of a digression. But they're meeting less and less resistance. By April of 1945, Franklin Roosevelt, U.S. president, he ends up dying. This is one of these, another date that I think we should keep in mind. And while this is happening, while he's dying, Russia. Oh, and maybe I should tell you that Franklin Roosevelt, he died in the arms of another woman. So if you want to know more about that, maybe you could look it up. It wasn't his wife. Eleanor wasn't there when he died, so a little scandalous. But anyway, while he's dying, Russia moves into Berlin, and there's a really good movie about this. It's in German. It's called Der Untergang. In English, we call it Downfall. I think it's available on Netflix currently. Uh, so Russia is moving into Berlin, and Hitler believes until April 29th, he's believing in this final victory that he sure would come at any moment now. He ended up going a little crazy at the end there for a number of reasons, but he was kind of a crazy guy in general. But he was pretty sure that this final victory was just around the corner, and any minute now, the Soviets and the Americans and British would give up. But April 30th, he realizes that that's not going to happen, and he shoots himself in his head, in his bunker. You know, so his wife, who he married that day, Eva Braun, shot herself, and they poisoned their dog because he didn't want his dog to be captured either. Afterwards, Hitler had his and Eva Braun's body taken out to just this little pit and set on fire so that he couldn't be paraded around like Mussolini was after Mussolini was killed. I don't want to say assassinated, but after he was killed. And today, what's left of it was called the Führer bunker, Hitler's personal bunker. This is what it looks like today. There's a very handsome gentleman with his brother, and so this is just a trash can sitting on top of. Our tour guide told us that's where the Führer bunker was, and it's just apartment buildings there. Now, there's actually a placard that notes that it's there, but I read an article a couple of weeks ago that said they're thinking of taking that down because it's becoming a shrine of sorts for neo-Nazis. Um, so Hitler dies. You think the war is over, and it's kind of over, but Hitler named this guy Doenitz. There's supposed to be an umlaut over the E. It's pronounced Dönitz for some reason. So Admiral Dönitz was a Navy guy, and he was named the successor, the next Führer, but he's only in charge for 8 days because Germany surrenders on May 8th, 1945, and we get what's known as VE Day, VE Victory in Europe Day. And so here's from the Daily Mail, VE Day, it's all over. And here's some newspapers. You know, Roosevelt's dead, Hitler ends up dying. So here's Dönitz, he's declared the new Führer, but we fight on. So the war in Europe ends so officially on May 8th, 1945. And so we're leaving out the Pacific Theater from this, but for what we're about to do, it took us 52 minutes to get to this point without talking about the Pacific Theater, and that was as quick as I could do it. So I think the crash course videos will help fill in some of the information that we missed on that. I just want to go over a couple more things. So here are some casualties after the war. You see in red, these are the military deaths, and in this orange color are the civilian deaths. And just look at these countries who are losing the most populations. And then the blue represents the deaths as percentage of their total population. So the Soviets are losing, it looks like 13% of their total population. Poland ends up losing, what's between 12 and 24? 18% of their total population. China is another big loser here, and you see that a lot of these deaths are civilian deaths happened to Poland. Indonesia, of all places, but that's in the Pacific Theater. India, it's also part of the Pacific Theater. So these are the allied nations. You see that the United States, we lose virtually no civilians to this war. There's actually one attempt. It's kind of hilarious, except somebody actually got hurt. But the Japanese, the only attempt to, I guess, bomb the United States was they set up these balloons that would catch the weather, and they would transport bombs from Japan all the way to the United States. And there was a family having a picnic in the mountains in the Rockies, and I think it was in the Rockies, and they ended up dying as a result of being bombed by the Japanese. But that's sort of an isolated incident. Alaska, there's some fighting along the Aleutian Islands in Alaska. That's that chain that sort of runs down Alaska. But Alaska wasn't a state at the time. It was a U.S. territory, but not a state at the time. But some of these other countries, you see that Lithuania, they suffered some rather high percentage-wise civilian deaths, and I guess some military too. Oops. But then in terms of the Axis powers, you notice that Germany and Japan take the brunt of it. Romania, of all places, Hungary, they are also Axis nations, so they suffer some pretty high casualties. Italy too, and then you see other, and the other is just sort of a mixture. Um, just for an example of what might be included here is what's known as Vichy France, and France is divided in half. There's occupied France, and Vichy France after the war, and it took me a long time to figure out the difference between those. Occupied was occupied by the Germans. Vichy France was led by a French person. He was a French leader. Uh, he was sort of considered a coward for collaborating with the Germans, but in his heart, I believe that he just wanted to make it as less bad as possible for the French people. So southern France became known as Vichy France, and that's what would be included in this other category down here. So these are just the war deaths. I mean, they're a lot here, and so as a percentage of the whole, these Allied civilians, a lot of the big percentage there is the Soviet Union and China. The Soviets, of course, dying to the Germans, the Chinese dying to the Japanese invasion. And you'll notice that China's flag is a little different. Well, they're not communist. They're not that communist country yet. We'll talk about them. We have a whole lecture dedicated to China. And this is what Germany looks like after the war is over. So it's occupied by Great Britain and the Americans and the Soviet Union, France a little bit. And part of the terms of the peace treaty, which we'll talk more about on the next lecture, is that Germany is divided up into 4 sectors: the American sector, the British, the Soviets, and then the French down here. This becomes Luxembourg. This goes back to Poland, these 2 areas here. Soviets get this territory. And then this right here is actually Berlin, the capital of Germany. It also gets split up between the Soviets and the Americans and French and British. And it looks an awful lot like the British and the French have a lot to do with occupying this territory, but it's mostly the Americans who are in charge down here. So this is occupied Germany, and that's where we'll leave this lecture because it's been an hour so far, and we got to get to some more. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you next video.